Welcome back everyone to another NASCAR Heat 5 setup video. Today's video focuses on Texas Motor Speedway, and while at the onset it seems very similar to Atlanta Motor Speedway that we've already covered a few days ago, they race very differently. The banking transitions into and off the corners make this track run very differently than Atlanta, even though they're exactly the same length. Also, this is one of the few tracks in the game that have really good AI. A lot of the tracks have AI that are sort of all over the place. They may be too fast in one part of the track, too slow in another, but Texas is one of my favorite tracks to run against the AI because they seem to be really smooth and have the speeds about right for the entirety of the lap. So we'll be talking about the Cup cars as well as Xfinity and the trucks. So let's get to it. Before we get into the setup discussion, there's a few other pieces of information that I wanted to pass along. First, be sure to check out the video I did talking about NASCAR Heat 4 setups in NASCAR Heat 5. In the video, I talk about whether or not these Heat 4 setups work in Heat 5, and also my approach to setups in NASCAR Heat 5. Next, let's talk about tire wear settings. I generally work with normal settings, so normal wear and normal tire wear fall off. And the reason I do that is so that we can get a very good baseline, which is the most important thing for me to pass along to you guys. That way, if you're using more aggressive tire wear settings, more wear, less grip as the tires wear, then you'll know that you need to tighten the car up some in order to save the tires, in particular the right rear. If you're using less aggressive settings, which would be less tire wear, more grip in the tires as they wear, then you know that you can get by with running a little bit looser setup. So using normal settings for both tire wear as well as grip fall off allows me to create that baseline. I do enjoy using the other settings, particularly having the more aggressive settings and less grip as the fall off happens, but I think normal on both tire wear and fall off gives us a very good baseline. Also, the focus of my setups is on stability. I don't focus so much on single lap speed or worry about single lap qualifying type speed. I'm more interested in the race and having a good car from the beginning of the run through the middle of the run and then finishing up the run strong as the fuel wears out. And then finally, when I'm doing setups for both Cup, Xfinity, as well as the trucks, I like to keep these as close to each other as possible so that it gives the same feel across all three series. In general, Xfinity and trucks run a little bit tighter for me using the same setup as I would use in the Cup cars. So in general, I'm going to loosen those up just a little bit in order to get the identical feel that I have with Cup. So with that out of the way, let's move into the setup. We'll begin in the Cup cars, where I'm actually going to show you two different setups, or more appropriately, two different variations of the same setup, and give you guys an opportunity to see which one works better for you. Starting out with the one that is the most friendly on the tires, and by that I mean the right front and the right rear wear nearly identical over the course of a run, with maybe 1 to 2% variation between the right front and the right rear is about all. So a very balanced and stable setup. Starting with the shock settings, no surprise here, 10s across the board. But as I have mentioned in other videos, I do enjoy going a little bit more aggressive, particularly on the bump settings, just to give it a stiffer feel to the suspension overall. So I do that generally on all four corners of the car, and then if I need to adjust entry or exit, I can adjust individual corners and work from there. But for the purposes of our release video, we're going to stick with the 10s across the board, but I just wanted to point that out for you guys as something that I really do like the feel of, a little bit stiffer suspension here in the Heat 5 setups. Moving on down to the weight settings. Maximum left side weight, 52% on the front weight. Now, why do I use that as the front weight? Why not 51? Why not 53 or so on? Well, the front weight really depends on the rest of the settings that you use within the setup. Some setups you can get by with using a lot less. Some setups will require a lot more. In fact, the setup we're going to see here in just a second, the variation that I mentioned off of this setup actually has a lot more front weight. So it really all depends on your other settings. And what I'm trying to get to with the front weight is the minimum amount of front weight that will keep the car stable, particularly on corner entry and corner exit. Too little front weight and the car will be unstable, meaning that the car will want to get loose anytime you touch the steering wheel the slightest amount. So I use just enough front weight to keep that from happening. And there's generally a tolerance here. I could get by with probably 51.5, 51.7, somewhere in there, but 52.0 gets me a very stable car that I'm looking for. But as always, adjust that and see what works best for you. Wedge controls the rotation of the car, how quickly the car rotates, and 48% worked out very well for me. I also tested using lower numbers than this, such as 47.5, 47.0, and the car responded very well. However, over the course of the long run, it simply wore out the right rear tire too much, such that 48.0 ended up being the best middle of the road setting in order to get the tire wear that I was looking for. But if you're looking for the car to rotate more, then you'll want to lower the wedge number to 47.5, 47.0, and so on. If you want to tighten up the car, you don't want the car to rotate near as much, then increase this number to 48.5, 49.0, and so on. Now moving on to the spring settings. 1,000 pounds left front, 1,200 pounds in the right front. I particularly like the 1,200 pounds in the right front, as this is great for stability. This is the maximum right front spring, and it just gives you something to lean on, particularly on corner entry and through the center of the corner. As you drop this right front spring, you will find that the car will rotate more, so it'll make the car looser overall throughout the corner, and in particular, I use it as a great adjustment for corner entry. So again, if you're too tight on corner entry, then lower this number to 1150, 1100, and so on, and that will really help the rotation of the car. Moving on now to the rear springs. 150 pounds of split in the rear springs, and that's enough to allow the car to rotate, particularly from the center of the corner to exit, without allowing it to get too loose. If I increase the split in the rear tires, meaning that I lower this left rear spring to something like, say, 420, 400, or even lower, that's going to help the car rotate on exit whenever I get back to the throttle. However, over the course of a long run, it can cause the right rear tire to wear out and cause some instability on corner exit simply because you've worn out the right rear tire. So in summary, if you want the car to rotate better when you get back to the throttle in the center of the corner and on exit, then you'll want more split in the rear springs and also stiffer rear springs overall. But you often will do that at the expense of the right rear tire on a long run, which makes it a great thing to do for, say, a qualifying setup, but not so much in the race. If you use less split in the rear tires, then you will tighten the car up, make it more stable overall on corner exit, but you can also make the car very tight as well, and you can start to abuse the right front tire. So a good balance here, depending on how you use the gas pedal. So if you use the gas pedal as an on-off switch, you're either at 0% or 100%, then you're probably going to need a smaller rear spring split, simply because you need the stability. If you're more smooth on and off the gas, then you can get by generally with a larger split. So that is a great way to adjust a car and the rotation of the car overall. Moving on to the tire settings, nothing special here. 20 pounds on the left, 50 in the right front, 48.5 in the right rear. Did spend a little bit of time on tire pressures, but not a whole lot. Overall, there is plenty of adjustability. I just simply didn't want to get the tires too much underinflated or overinflated here. The more you lower the tire pressures, the more grip overall you're going to get to an extent, but the more stability you're going to feel in the car. The higher the number you use in the tire pressures, you'll get a little bit more straightaway speed, but you'll lose a little bit of grip in the corner. So it's a balancing act just depending on what you're looking for. And oops, wrong button. Now over to the miscellaneous settings. Here we're using +4 and -4 on the camber. I did a ton of testing with the camber here at Texas, and 4.0 was the maximum that I could use without hurting the tire wear. So generally I'm somewhere around 3 4.0, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. But here at Texas, 4.0 had no negative effects on the tire wear over the course of the run, with the exception of the left front. It does hit the left front pretty hard. However, it didn't make any difference as far as the speed over the course of a run. In fact, it even helped the speed in the long run just a little bit over some of the other options. But going above 4.0 on either the left front or right front did cause tire wear issues. So as always, test out these numbers and see what works best for you. Maybe you can get by with a little bit more camber. Maybe you need to use less camber in the front of the car. It's all about what works best for you, and the 4.0 here in both corners of the front worked very well for me overall. Front sway bar, maximum 2.0. The entire setup is basically built around this particular setting. This gives us maximum stability. Obviously, this is very different than what we used in Heat 4, and that's kind of the point. I wanted to give you some very different feelings from the different setups and let you choose which one you prefer. With the front sway bar, the higher the number, the more stable and the tighter the car will be. The car won't want to rotate as much with the higher number here in the front sway bar. So if the car is just too tight overall and you want to loosen it up, then drop this number, but I would only do so by 1 to 2 clicks at the most, because this makes a very large difference in the car. You lower this too much and you'll get a very unstable car very quickly. Moving on to the track bar. Left side at 11, right side at 10. A little bit higher on the left side, as that helps the entry to the corner. Wanted to get a little bit more rotation on corner entry in order to keep as much speed into the corner as possible. A little bit lower on the right side, simply because I wanted to save that right rear tire. This is going to make the car a little bit tighter on corner exit, which over the course of a long run will certainly help that right rear tire. So if you're looking for more speed on corner entry, a looser car on corner entry, then raise that left side track bar. If you're looking for more rotation on corner exit, a looser car on corner exit, then raise the right side track bar. Moving on now to the brake bias. Again, 77% is pretty much the default I'm going to show you guys at most every track, simply because I want to make sure that the brake bias is high enough that you don't get loose on green flag pit stops. So this is something you'll definitely want to adjust to your own liking, and it's all based on how you use the brakes, how smooth you are on the brakes, and so on. But the higher the brake bias number, the more front brake you'll be using, which makes the car tighter when under brakes. Lower this number and you will get the car looser under braking, especially heavy braking, and that's certainly something we want to avoid on green flag pit stops. Don't want you guys spinning out simply because of a default brake bias that I give you. Normally my numbers are somewhere between about 73 to about 80 on some occasions, just depending on what I need the brakes to do. Here at Texas, I don't really use the brakes over the normal course of a lap, unless maybe I'm in traffic and I need to slow down the car a little bit quicker than simply backing out of the throttle. So in my case, I can simply set this up for green flag pit stops and move on about my day. Grill tape, I've talked about this many times over the past few years in NASCAR Heat. It's not something I spend a lot of time on. I basically want to get it in the general ballpark to where you're not overheating, and then I leave it alone. 40% works very well for that, but there's still plenty of room for you to adjust and figure out exactly what temperature you want to run in the engine. As long as you're around 250, 255 at the absolute max, I would say, then you should be fine. Just don't overheat and you'll be okay. Wheel lock and steering offset are pretty much at my standard numbers, 10 degrees at the wheel lock. This is a great way to adjust the quickness of the steering, the overall sensitivity of the steering from track to track. And the wheel lock, the lower number, will be slower steering reactions. You'll actually have to turn the wheel more to get the same reaction from the wheel. Use higher numbers here, something like the defaults are somewhere around 17 or 18, I believe, or up around 20 or higher, and you'll get much quicker steering. So it's all about the feel that you're looking for. 10 degrees works perfectly well for me because I prefer a little bit slower steering than the game provides by default. Steering offset is really tied to the amount of camber that you have in the car. 0.05 gives me just a little bit of a turn to the right down the straightaway, but not a huge amount that it causes instability. The higher number on the offset, the more the steering wheel will try to offset that pull to the right. So be careful. Get this number too high and you can cause the car to get unstable on the straightaway. So anywhere from about 0.5, maybe a click or two above or below that number is perfectly fine for me. And then finally, the gear settings. So I didn't touch first through third gear, really no reason to. They were perfectly fine for me. But then we get down to the rear end ratio. This is a spot where you've got a lot of options, really just depending on what you're looking for. 350 gear turns quite a bit of RPMs, which is not so great necessarily for the short run or a qualifying gear maybe, but it's really good over the long run because as your speed slows down, you still are able to keep some RPM in the engine. So that's why I use the 350, but you can certainly get by with using maybe a little bit higher, possibly, but particularly you could use lower, something like a 345, 340, or even lower, just depending on what you're looking for. So that's going to do it for the first setup we're going to take a look at in the Cup car. Now let's go look at a variation. As you take a look at this setup, you'll notice it is extremely similar and nearly identical in a lot of ways to the one we were just looking at. So rather than going section by section as we just did, I'm going to point out a few major changes that I made and talk about why I made them. Starting with the weight settings. The front weight is actually maxed out at 55%. So why did I do that? Well, this gives us maximum stability. More front weight, it will tighten the car up and give it a lot of stability, which can really help you if you are prone to using the gas pedal and the brake pedal as on-off switches and are not very smooth. This can really help you out and stabilize the car. But there are other reasons why I did that. In this case, using a higher front weight number stabilizes the car and allows me to get by with more split in the rear springs. So this really helps the overall rotation of the car, as we've talked about before. So by using nearly 300 pounds of rear spring split, almost double what we were using in the other setup, it just keeps the car rotating a little bit more and provides a different feel. So some of you, I'm sure, will prefer the setup we just got done looking at and going over. Some of you will prefer this one because it gives a little bit different feel, particularly in how you drive the car to match up with the fact that the car rotates a little bit more overall. And with that additional rotation, this setup wears the right rear tire a little bit more for me. It's still not bad, maybe about 5% more over the course of a long run than the right front. But still, at Texas, tire wear overall is not a huge issue on normal settings. So it really doesn't present any issues for me. So I was able to get by with more split here in the rear of the car. But if you try this one out and end up liking this setup, however, you find that the car is just a little bit too loose and wearing the right rear just a little bit too much over the long run, then simply increase the left rear spring and that will reduce the split and should give you that stability back on corner exit. Moving over to the track bar, you notice that the left side and right side are a little bit closer here, slightly different numbers, still very much in the same ballpark as what we were looking at a few minutes ago, but a little bit different here, only 0.5 inches higher on the left side than the right side. I don't need quite as much left side track bar here in this setup simply because the split in the rear tires is taking care of the rotation of the car, so I can get by with a little bit narrower range here for the track bar. Also, just to show you a little different gear setting, I used the 3.40. However, you can certainly use the identical gear that we just looked at of the 3.5 or any number of other options here. Just wanted to show you something else to give you something to think about. Now that takes care of the Cup cars, let's take a look at some slight variations in Xfinity and trucks. As I've mentioned plenty of times before, the Xfinity cars as well as the trucks generally run a little bit tighter for me. However, that is not really the case here at Texas. I am able to use the identical setup and it works very well for me. Now, I've made several changes and some of them worked very well, some of them not quite as much. simply due to tire wear issues. So what I'm going to talk about here in the Xfinity cars is some of the things that I usually like to test out just to see if they end up getting out some of that tightness that I normally feel. And that starts with the weight settings and the front weight. I usually like to test out using about 0.5% lower front weight. This helps the car to rotate just a little bit more, and I can generally get by with doing that in the Xfinity or the truck simply because it doesn't cause any instability in the car for them. The other change that I love to make adjustments with is the wedge. I usually like to come out and try lower by about 0.5% to a full percent here, again, just to help the car rotate a little bit more. Now, usually one or two of these changes will do exactly what I'm looking for, but if that is not the case, let's put these back the way they were, then I will come over to the track bar. The track bar is a favorite of mine to make small adjustments to the car if I am very close to where I want to be, but I need just a small little bit of help, say on corner entry or corner exit. For the left side track bar, helping the entry, I will usually come in and increase this about 1/2 inch. Same thing with the right rear, just to give the car just a little bit more help in rotating overall. So those are the changes I generally make when swapping between Cup and Xfinity, and the initial things that I like to test. Now, one thing that I noticed very quickly in the Xfinity car is I didn't need to use the same gearing as the Cup car, as we hit that rev limiter very quickly doing so. So 333 was about the most RPM I could get by with here. So 333, 325, and so on would be your best bet, just depending on what you're looking for, race speed or qualifying speed. So that'll take care of Xfinity. Now let's move on to the trucks. Here in the trucks, as mentioned earlier, we're looking at very much the same setup as we saw in the Cup cars, with one exception, and that is with the right side track bar. I raised the right side track bar up to 11 inches to match the left side, simply to help giving me a little bit of a boost on corner exit. I need the car to rotate a little bit more on exit, and this certainly helped out with that. So a very minor change in order to make the truck feel basically the same as what I had with the Cup cars. Also, the Cup cars and Xfinity cars are basically very close in terms of speed here at Texas, but the trucks are a little bit slower here, so I needed to change the rear end ratio and figure out where I wanted to go with that, and the 340 gear worked perfectly well. As always, a click or two in either direction here to figure out what works best for you based on what you need. Are you looking more qualifying? You looking more race setup? But 340 gear worked out very well for me. Also, a small change on grill tape, simply because I noticed during testing that the car was running, or the truck was running a little bit cooler. So I increased that a minor amount, but that is really not a setup adjustment that's going to affect anything. Just simply made it because I noticed that the temperature was a little lower. Now, the other thing that you might have noticed is that in Xfinity and trucks, I didn't go over both of the setups as I did with Cup, and that was simply to save some time, but I would certainly expect them to have similar results as what we talked about in the Cup car. So that's going to do it for today. Thank you so much for joining me, and stay tuned for more setups for NASCAR Heat 5.